In fact, first I have to introduce also Kate Yanduganova, who is my co-lecturer in this presentation, and I will yes, present our no. In fact, the main object of our presentation could be understood as merely philological, not to do something with Jewish thought. And it was not, in fact, our own decision to present it in this section and not in a philological one. What makes it possible to present our lecture among the discussion of philosophical topics is that it is methodological. It is methodological in the way that it tries to build a wide scope paradigm to discuss a specific line of exegesis, of specific commentary on the Jewish texts, and first of all on the Torah, the Pentateuch, and Moses, the author and was the hero of this book. But in fact, I do suggest that this methodology that we will try to trace is applicable to other difficult Jewish biblical books too. For example, the same thing seems to be working, for example, for the wide scope of traditional exegesis of the book of Job. It is called modus receptus, so it deals with the reception of the image of Moses in tradition, or even in different traditions, and it is explained as the compositional and narratological problems of the Pentateuch as shown by epic paraphrases. What do we mean by speaking about epic paraphrases? The Pentateuch, the Torah, is a book with a not really a coherent, or at least with a very difficult composition. And most contemporary biblical scholars, perhaps rightly, explain it by a long textual, long literary history of the development of the Torah during some centuries of ancient Israeli and Judaic culture. But as a result, all the writers who wanted to present Moses as both the author and the hero of the Torah had difficulties to make such a presentation, because they had difficulties to understand what was the genre, what was the composition, and what was the narratological composition of the Torah. And when we speak of epic paraphrases, we mean first-hand the texts which try to create a coherent, non-Jewish, non-gefilte fish type, and not a Masechet type, but a coherent, consistent narrative, kind of romance sometimes, depicting Moses as a figure. And they all, though these authors came from different backgrounds, they all share the same problems. And the point at which we try to point, sorry, it's a bit tautological, is that there is a unity between all these and even some other ancient and medieval authors, because not they had shared background. Sometimes they had, sometimes they had not. But they all had to cope with the same problems posed by the Pentateuch itself, and these are sometimes the same problems that contemporary biblical scholars cope with, but in another genre, in the genre of documentary criticism. So among the main authors we wanted to present in our wide scope are, for example, in gray, Jewish Hellenistic authors influenced by the Greek Hellenistic system of genres and systems of representation of heroes. In some way, Divrei Nimshel Moshe, a medieval Jewish work built on rabbinical exegesis, but also influenced by some outer, some perhaps Islamic or European genres, and these are Jewish authors. And on the other hand, we have the same situation among the Christian receptions of Moses. When we speak, so it is what are the epic paraphrases or mosaic epics, as we called it here. When we generally, and what is the hidush, what is the point we try to trace, when we speak about commentary, about exegesis, we may speak about explaining some events. For example, allegorical exegesis deals mostly with figures and events and explains how one or other event or one or another figure prefigures or means something to be explained via allegories. But also what is noticed mostly in the last 70 years is exegesis can be also a midrashic one, which deals with a separate psukim, with separate sticks of the Bible. But there is also a third point that we try to suggest here. And this third point is that compositions that build on the Pentateuch in the material are influenced by the composition or by the lack of composition that we have in the Torah. So, in order to show the methodological paradigm we try to trace here, in which the composition of a book about Moses, the very composition, the very structure, how it is generically built, is also a means of commentary in an exegetical tool. We choose a book which most certainly could not be almost at all influenced, for example, by the Midrashic tradition. It is highlighted here in red. It is a not so well-known composition. It is an old English poem, Exodus, which dates to 11th century and which firsthand will be presented by Kate as master in English philology. So the case is that we have an old English poetic work which is influenced by Christian tradition with some perhaps fragmentary patristic education and by Old English poetic tradition. So it has nothing to do with all this Jewish world. It has nothing to do with Midrash. It has nothing to do, it is not informed by traditional commentary, traditional exegetical tools. But it has some kind of compositional correspondences with other Mosaic epics, and the suggestion is that this common background is not in common sources, first of all, and that's why we chose the most distanced from the Jewish world book. But it is influenced by the shared complex of problems that are posed by the very composition of the Pentateuch, of the Torah, as we have it. So next one, perhaps. Или давай назад. Не, в смысле, вернемся назад. For example, how does it work? How I started to prepare to work on such a wide-scope problem. Artabanus, a Hellenistic Jewish writer, when we read it first, we think that it is something not Jewish at all. He tells us that Moses was adorned by the Greek under the name of Hermes. He tells us that Moses invented Egyptian hieroglyphics. He tells us all his material at first glance has nothing to do with what we have in the Torah. But if we begin to study the composition of the structure of Artabanus' work, we begin to understand that he is influenced by the Torah because he follows the events in some logic. And even he is almost certainly influenced by proto-midrashic, by Jewish oral tradition. But it becomes obvious only when we begin to study his work structurally, when we begin to compare the composition of his work with the original structure on the Pentateuch, and we begin to see that there are structural problems that he tries, perhaps intuitively, to solve in his work. And something like that we will try to show on the concrete, on the specific example of the Old English poem Exodus, and so perhaps Kate will begin to present it in some details.
Yeah, so what we are saying is that composition is a problem. And it is also an answer to some problems which the first text in the Torah presents. So here we have the structure of the Torah, and as you can see, it is quite complex. It mostly follows a chronological pattern, telling the story of how the tribe of Israel developed, how their children grew, from whom they were born. So the story of family or a tribe, year by year. But it is also broken in some points by introducing the codes, the long passages or whole books that deal with laws or morals and that have nothing to do with the development of the narrative.
And for example, almost all Hellenistic Jewish works, both Philo of Alexandria or Book of Jubilees, have to cope with the problem why the Jewish law has narratives inside. What the story of some concrete Abraham or Isaac or Jacob have to do with the laws we have to follow in our lives. It is one of generic difficulties for ancient readers of the Torah. But the difficulties for the Old English also were not like that. But the problem is one of the first problems that come out to the surface when we try to understand what is the genre and what is the composition of the Pentateuch.
Okay, so the Old English authors had their own good tradition of narratives. They had long heroic poems which told of people developing, tribe developing, so they had this idea laid down very well. And they, in order to comment on the Torah, they took a very small portion of one book of the Torah, the Exodus, and they took only one episode, the story of how the tribe of the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, with some preparation and some follow after. They mostly tried to keep it simple and linear, following the two chapters, Exodus 13 and 14, verse by verse, but they also had to break it, because at the same time the tradition was pressing at them, making them to include also the parts about the law. So the actual structure is not linear. It looks mostly like this. As you see, the poem begins with an explanation of Mosaic law. It says that law is the most important thing which has come to us from Moses, and encourages the people to hear them, these laws, and to obey them. This part is somewhat taken from the book of Deuteronomy, which is again a whole book devoted only to the explanation of the law and its meaning for the people. And it embraces these laws as the most sacred and most moral things that human can have. Then it goes to describe the giver of these laws, Moses himself, also using some imagery from this last fifth book. It does not go to the first chapters of Exodus to give the biography of Moses. Instead, it only gives some small points, some third-person description, which is exactly as is mentioned in the last chapter of Deuteronomy. So it doesn't say that Moses was born in this place or that place, whom he married, where he went and what he did. It said that Moses was lawgiver to whom God gave the power to work wonders. And here it has a very distinct digression, although a very short one. When it tells why God has this power to work wonders, it also tells of the first encounter when Moses and God met face to face. It gives us a very short rendering of the episode with the burning bush. And this is where God says to Moses, "I am your God, I am he who created heaven and earth." So the story of creation of the Bereshit actually enters the narrative here, and we have it shown by this dotted line, because it is very small and it doesn't have its own episode. Then we come to a little bit of the narrative, when the poem tells you how the Israelites were oppressed by the Egyptians and how they prepared for their march out of Egypt. Interestingly, it does not mention the plagues, it does only in passing. It does not mention how Moses argued with the Pharaoh. It doesn't mention Aaron or his participation in these disputes. It only says that the Israelites were ready to go now. And then, as they go, they come to the Red Sea, and this is where the poem has another very long digression. These green parts are almost half of the text, 300 lines in length. This is the so-called story of the patriarchs. It has almost nothing to do with the narrative, and was dismissed by most scientists as some very alien and strange thing. But actually it is connected on the level of images and problems with the story of the Israelites which we have just left. Because of course Noah and Abraham are both the forefathers of this tribe. They make it unite, they make it sound like one person with one will, and they reinforce the idea of the covenant with God that will bring the Israelites to the salvation. They also share some common images, such as the image of water, because the Red Sea is of course connected to the danger of the flood, and the idea of complete trust in God, because Abraham has to trust in God to kill his son or not kill his son, and the Jews have also to trust in God who will not kill them by the hand of the Egyptians. This digression ends with the promise to Abraham that his seed will be numerous, and the reader is transposed ahead in time with the vision of the seed until he sees the people who represent this very descendants of Abraham sitting on the cliffs of the sea and waiting for the Egyptians to come. So here again is a small part of the narrative marked in red, where he crosses the sea and the Egyptians also come in. And after that, another part of the law begins. The elders, yes. Okay, yes.
Strangely enough, the idea of Abraham seeing the Israelites at the Red Sea is known to us from a rabbinic midrash, Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael. There is no chance that the English poet had any knowledge of Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael. But this is a point of correspondence which does come from nowhere. I will try to explain how it can come to be a bit later. But I make a notice that, for example, the connection between Abraham and the Red Sea, that Abraham had a vision of future Red Sea splitting, is also known from rabbinic sources, for example. We do not trace the history of the motive, we just note that that is the fact and it is extraordinary.
Okay, so the splitting is actually foreshadowed here by the image of the flood, here by the prophetic vision of Abraham, here by the speech of Moses, who describes it to the Israelites when it is about to happen. Here it happens at least, and the people celebrate it. Here we have the end, or at least here where the next poem begins. As you see, this structure makes it clear that the central part of the poem is not a narrative. It actually has a kind of a parabolic structure when it starts with the law and ends with the law. And this idea of the law of Moses, which has been followed through time and space, from Noah and Abraham to the Israelites, and ultimately to the readers of the poem who are present now, is the most salient part of the poem. And inside it goes deeper and deeper until it comes to the very beginning, to the story of the patriarchs.
So, when we took the first glance of the Exodus poem, we could have the impression that it takes the narrative part of the book of Shemot and just make a poetic paraphrase just of a small narrative part of the book of Shemot. But then when we try to establish what the composition of this poem is, we come to understand that this narrative composition is at several points interrupted. And those interruptions, they also have, in the most cases, some similarities to other points of the Torah. And when we follow all these lines, we have to understand that what in fact the Old English author, the Old English poet does do is trying to retell all the Torah, the whole of the Torah, in the scope, in the frame of the Exodus narrative. Because he introduces inside his Exodus narrative both general encomium of Moses, both patriarchal stories that had nothing to do with the Exodus, both the story of the transmission by Moses of his song to the elders of the nation, by the elders into the books, and from the books to the audience of the author, who at several points says that he knows it both from books and both from the elders of his Christian nation. So here we have the parallel with the ending of the Torah, with the transmission of the Torah, which follows in the end of the book of Deuteronomy. And here we have the same thing. At the place where one would expect just the song of the sea, Shirat Hayam, we have not only Shirat Hayam, but also a Shirat Moshe, code, a final point of the whole Torah, introduced in the place where just only the first song, the song of the sea, should be. So he unites different parts of the Torah into the frame of the narrative. So at our second glance, we understand that not only a small episode of the Torah narrative, but the whole of the Torah is what the author tries to convey in his poem. We will see it in some details further.
Okay, actually, there is another.
Also, I may note that, for example, the same thing comes when Philo of Alexandria writes the life of Moses. And even paradoxically, it is just Noah and Abraham as the two examples of what we have in the laws of Moses that Philo cites when he tries to explain what the laws of Moses are. I stop here.
Okay, actually we have now a small example of conflation inside the poem, when the whole book of Leviticus is conflated just in the image of the clouds and the fire. So from Sukkot, here from the tents, which look like the clouds and which actually have later parallels in biblical and rabbinic exegesis, to the fire, which looks like the Sinai. The whole peregrination around the desert is also shown in one very small passage where these two pillars are mentioned together. Okay, so the main idea is that from one part to another, you get these images, these metaphors, until you understand that they all have a common meaning, which you can put together to understand. And you see that all these images work to provide you with a living, continuing tradition that started somewhere at the time of the creation of the world, that started with the words that God told Moses, and then came to you. So this idea is actually reinforced because most of the heroes of the poem play a double role. God is the one who narrates things. God in this way is the author of the poem and the ultimate authority from whom the words come. Moses hears things from God, and in this way he is compared to the readers, but he also tells things, so that he's also the author. The author becomes the reader becomes the next author, and so it works in a never-ending movement. And this tradition is facilitated because it is always conveyed by the wise men, the bookmen, who stand at each point and make sure that the tradition goes on at every place from one person to another. So Moses himself is compared to the wise men, and the wise men of the Israelite tribe tell his story to their people. And there are another book-learned men, the people who understand books, who will later explain to the readers of the poem what the author here means. Okay, yes, this tradition may be very shortly summarized in one word. The Old English word source, which means truth, verity, is the thing which unites all the episodes of the poem because it appears in almost all the passages. God is the Lord of the truth, who tells true word. He tests Abraham to know if he is really true to his God. And Moses is also the true man, the truest of all the tribes, who passes his words of truth and wisdom to everyone, including the contemporary readership of the poem.
So, just to end, we have fortunately no opportunity to enter into detail and into comparison between different stratagems that different authors choose to cope with those problems. But in general, we can say that the Torah, as a result of a very, very, very complex literary process, poses before all kinds of those ancient and medieval Jewish and Christian authors some shared compositional and narratological problems. For example, that it begins with the creation of the whole world, but it ends with the epitaph of one man, Moses. It contains narratives, but it contains also legislation. It contains poetry by Moses, and it contains third-person narratives about Moses, or without Moses, when we speak about the patriarchs. It also has Moses as a heroic figure described in the third person, and also Moses as the first person speaking in the Deuteronomy. And finally, Moses as the pseudepigraphic, as a traditional author of the whole of the Pentateuch, in which he is also the hero. So here we try to present the complexity of the main compositional and narratological problems in the image of Moses that all of the author we spoke of, we have now the time to speak about, have had to cope with, and their shared background, as it seems, is in this complex of problematics. Narrative and law, first person, third person, author, hero, and author of the book that God gave. At the same time, Moses is threefold. He is the agent of God, he is the speaking person, the author, and the writer sometimes, and he is also the personage inside his own speech, or inside the speech of God. And these are the problems that all those authors try to deal with, to create a coherent composition from this difficult Turanic structure.
I suggest the next topic, Moses is participant of a conference. Well, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. Please, your questions have very little time, but nevertheless.
My question is, did you use the narratives about Moses from the books of Josephus?
More or less. So it is not a separate narrative about Moses, so it is not enumerated here. But in fact, yes, certainly Jewish antiquities are part of this long history, and it is almost sure that, for example, in some way, the author of the Old English poem did know something from Josephus, perhaps through Clement of Alexandria and so on.
This image of cloud as tent is also seen in many patristic works, and interestingly, it's also seen in Joseph. So it may be a shared heritage that comes from Joseph to Augustine or Jerome, for example, and later to the Old English poem.
So thank you very much. It was very good.